Drinking has been one of America's favorite pastimes since the country's inception. When Prohibition began in 1919 with the ratification of the 18th Amendment, drinking was changed forever. The amendment prohibited the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. In 1933, after Prohibition's failure, the 21st Amendment was passed, repealing the 18th Amendment. Even those who originally petitioned for Prohibition wanted it to come to an end. However, concerns over alcohol began long before the 18th Amendment was passed. Religious concerns appeared in the early 1800s, and by the 1850s, about a dozen states had banned alcohol production out of religious fervor. Although this fervor eventually died out and the bans were lifted, Protestants still felt threatened by the drinking habits of others, especially Catholic immigrants. Meanwhile, Southern evangelists became angry at countless officials becoming drunk to church. They found alcohol to be an evil seizing the church and nation, and so took up the job to purify the nation by forcing others to abstain from alcohol. Some other Southern evangelists, like James Curry, wanted to improve educational opportunities for blacks and whites, and thought the best way to do so was to prohibit alcohol. Soon enough, these beliefs unified to form parties and leagues. In 1869, the Prohibition Party formed to promote a dry America, and in 1873, the Women's Crusade sought to destruct liquor and saloons through direct actions, petition campaigns, and demonstrations. Of course, campaigns rallied against the illegalization, but they weren't enough. An anti-saloon league, ALS, had formed in 1893 that spent millions on anti-alcohol literature and influenced the 1916 congressional elections by securing seats for ALS-supporting candidates. Within a year, the 18th Amendment was drafted, prohibiting the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcoholic beverages.
Although the noble experiment of Prohibition ultimately was unsuccessful in ridding America of its alcoholic tendencies, it did make some momentary improvements. According to Carey C. Kelly, alcohol consumption dropped by 30%, and the United States Brewers Association admitted the consumption of hard liquor was off 50% during Prohibition. Unfortunately, this study did not account for the alcohol consumption of those behind closed doors. Instead of becoming a time of reform, as those who pushed for Prohibition hoped, it became a time of drinking and crime. After passing the 18th Amendment, Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce the law and prohibit the manufacture, production, distribution, and sale of any beverage with more than 0.5% alcohol content. This law did not withhold the sale of medicinal alcohol prescribed by doctors, so people desperate for alcohol took it upon themselves to make some with their prescribed medicine. For example, they transformed rubbing alcohol into moonshine, homemade illegal alcohol, in their bathtubs. This use of medicinal alcohol had some serious consequences, leading to internal bleeding, paralysis, and sometimes death. These dangers show the lengths people were willing to go to have their alcohol during Prohibition. Americans found many ways to hide their liquor and drinks without questioning. People would get away with drinking by using hip flasks, hollowed canes, false books, to put their alcohol in. Country clubs became popular as men would be able to drink there under the pretense they were playing golf. Even more discreet ways of drinking emerged in the forms of speakeasies or blind pigs, illegal underground bars where one had to say an easy phrase or code to get in. Drinking during Prohibition extended from men in their 20s to women who began to drink in this modern era. The quality of these illegal bars differed according to class. The working class people could mostly only afford small underground bars, which were in some cases just someone's kitchen. The upper class citizens, meanwhile, could afford the swankier speakeasies with slightly better alcohol. The best speakeasies were the ones owned and run by mafia bosses such as Al Capone, who had all the connections. Bootlegging, or the illegal trade of alcohol, became the name of the game during the 20s. People wanted alcohol and were willing to buy it at high prices. Mobsters caught on and made a business out of people's needs. The criminal mastermind Al Capone essentially ran the whole operation of selling illegal alcohol. Capone organized the importation of alcohol from different states and countries, including Canada, and the distribution of alcohol through salespeople, delivery trucks, and speakeasies. Al Capone and other gangs also gained profits through labor racketeering, where they would infiltrate businesses, usually workers' unions, and collect the wages from the union members. Labor racketeers were sometimes commissioned by businesses to help them maintain competition with other businesses. Along with money came power for these gangsters who used their profits to bribe authorities to look the other way to their illegal dealings. Gangsters were able to pay off government officials, making them above the law and giving them more reason to commit crimes. On the other hand, not everyone was lucky enough to go unpunished through Prohibition. Poor men and women in states such as Virginia, North Carolina, and Texas were not as protected by the law like gangsters in the upper classes were. These Americans were subject to police laws, jails, and increasingly crowded federal and state prisons because of drinking. Authorities waved a blind eye towards the unjust treatment and even involved the Ku Klux Klan to help enforce Prohibition, which the Klan uses as an excuse to target immigrants, Catholics, and African Americans. In some places, authorities would raid distilleries, bars, and homes. These events would later have a great impact on many aspects of society. Political effects. The 1920s were turbulent and trying, and with all its under-the-table activity, there was bound to be some consequences. Prohibition shined a light on crime in America, which caused many side effects that are still prevalent today. During Prohibition, federal law enforcement agencies had a difficult time enforcing widespread sobriety in America, especially with little funds from Congress. Americans had little respect for the authorities, as it was so easy to ignore Prohibition laws. States in turn refused to pass Prohibition laws, repealed existing laws, or underfunded enforcement agencies. The uncooperative acts of the states led to Prohibition agents wiretapping to find the locations of secret breweries and going undercover in bars to arrest those taking part in illegal drinking. Law enforcement agencies arrested so many people that jails became overcrowded and court cases began to pile up, prompting the introduction of the plea bargain. In a plea bargain, a defendant would agree to plead guilty in exchange for the dropping of one or more charges. As a result, only about 60% of cases ended with a conviction. This tactic is still used in many court cases today. Even with the extensive policing of authorities, it was not until after Prohibition did law enforcement regain respect from the rest of society. In 1933, Prohibition was done and gone away with passing of the 21st Amendment, prompted by the crime and economic failure occurring throughout the decade, making the 18th Amendment the first amendment to the Constitution to be repealed. After its ratification, within the same year, President Roosevelt set the New Deal in motion, resulting in the creation of federal programs to reform America during the Great Depression. Congress passed anti-crime legislation that was meant to end crime and give esteem back to law enforcement. The Bureau of Investigation changed its name to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, otherwise known as the FBI. After Prohibition, law enforcement changed their tactics and improved their name to become more authoritative and official. According to Lisa McGurr, following Prohibition, police authority grew, jail construction grew, and courts turned to plea bargaining and parole. Prohibition led to the increased dominance of law enforcement and shifted power from the people back into the hands of the government. A shift of political parties was also another effect of Prohibition. In the 1928 election, the urban ethnic working class cast their votes in favor of the Democratic Party candidate Al Smith. Smith ran his campaign in opposition to the 18th Amendment, vowing to repeal it once elected. Before this election, working-class Americans had their own preferential party, but with the appeal of drinking freely once again, they all became partial to the Democratic Party. Prohibition greatly affected America's current political parties, as even today most working and middle-class citizens are Democrats. Prohibition was not all about the alcohol. It was a period of change and growth, not only for the society but the government too. Prohibition led to a more forceful law enforcement and legal system. The plea bargain was first used and the FBI was created. Working-class citizens shifted their bias to the Democratic Party, forever changing America's political parties. Prohibition effects on politics can still be seen today in the courts, elections, and authorities.
Economic effects. Because of the closing of distilleries and businesses, there was an immense job loss. Following this, the stock market crash of 1929 caused even more unemployment, agricultural crisis, and worldwide economic depression. However, some business owners became wealthy in dealing with alcohol because of its high demand. Those who sold it illegally went to jail, and money had to be spent to keep them in jail and enforce the law. Those who chose to attempt to distill their own alcohol often went to the hospital or died from alcohol poisoning, causing the economy and the medical field to increase. The government was greatly affected by the loss of tax revenues from alcohol, as many states had relied heavily on excise taxes on liquor sale. With the effects of Prohibition underway, the government lost billions in tax revenue and enforcement. This resulted in the most lasting consequence, where many states and the federal government would come to rely on income tax revenue to fund their budgets going forward. Before Prohibition came into action, entertainment and amusement industries were expected to gain revenue. Instead, they declined. They could no longer make profit without legal liquor sales. Speakeasies were establishments that illegally sold liquor and provided food and entertainment. They had no rules that they needed to follow, and each did what it wanted. Most cities had several speakeasies, and the people who craved alcohol would go to these establishments to pass the time and have fun, rather than the dry ones that abided by the laws. Producers completely controlled alcohol production, used whatever ingredients they wished, and manufactured alcohol of whatever strength they wished. By 1932, the Great Depression was well underway, and at least 1/4 of the American workforce was unemployed. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt took office and acted swiftly to try to stabilize the economy and provide jobs to relieve those who were suffering. Over the next 8 years, the government made plans called the New Deal. They aimed to restore some of the measure of dignity and prosperity to many Americans. President Franklin signed the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, National Industrial Recovery Act, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, and the Homeowners Loan Act, among others, with the intention of taking steps to end Prohibition. Despite Roosevelt's efforts, the nation's economy continued to struggle. In response, Roosevelt launched a second series of federal programs in 1935 called the Second New Deal. Among these new programs was the Works Progress Administration, the National Labor Relations Act, and the Social Security Act. However, now that selling and manufacturing alcohol was legal, authorities made post and hold laws, or PH laws, to deter the trade. PH laws required that alcohol distributors share future prices by posting them beforehand and holding these prices for a specific period of time. These laws were assumed to reduce unilateral incentives for distributors to reduce prices or have explicit collusion, an agreement among competitors to suppress rivalry.
Social-cultural causes. One of the most unexpected outcomes of the Prohibition was possibly how it brought America one step closer to racial equality. Blacks who had joined the Prohibition were given more respect and acceptance. In fact, according to Edward Ayers, blacks enjoyed their greatest political activity and visibility of the entire New South era in the Prohibition movement. However, while respect was created for blacks, it was destroyed for authorities and religion. Breaking the law and drinking became the new exciting fad among young people, and criminal activity became encouraged. This wasn't surprising, as jurors began to not give proper punishments while knowing the facts of the case. According to David Hansen, of 7,000 arrests in New York between 1921 and 1923, only 27 resulted in convictions. This disrespect trickled down to religion as people noticed failed promises and disgusting conducts of religious leaders like Methodist Bishop James Cannon Jr. He had to defend himself in the U.S. Senate for financial irregularities, in the Methodist Church for immoral conduct, and in both places for having a sexual affair with the secretary. To the public, this proved that prohibitionists were hypocrites who wanted to prohibit everyone except themselves. While people became masters at making wine independently at home, liquor became a luxury item and a symbol of affluence. People got fewer chances to drink, and so they began drinking abusively. Drinking was now done with the purpose to get drunk. Those who couldn't afford liquor anymore began to switch to other drugs such as opium, cocaine, hair tonic, and sterno. All of this added up to the stigmatization of alcoholics and hindered acceptance of treatments for them. Ironically, their prohibition caused a lot more women to drink and drink openly. After the Prohibition, this continued, and bar owners began adding bar stools and tables. Bars began to be called cocktail lounges and catered to women in cocktail dresses. These new changes can be found all throughout bars and society today. The decade following the passing of the 18th Amendment was eventful, wild, and dangerous. There were numerous unintended effects, some of which still continue on even today. People died drinking the dangerous alcohol they brewed up themselves, and gangsters like Al Capone were able to earn millions off of the illegal alcohol trade. Authorities became obsessed with crime and arrested thousands, prompting plea bargains to speed up all the court cases they had. Countless jobs were lost with the ban, and actions had to be quickly taken to help the country's economy. The entire idea of drinking changed, and it turned into a symbol of wealth. A simple repealment of this ban was not enough to overturn the effects. Women began drinking openly, most middle-class citizens leaned towards the Democratic Party, and the economy had crashed. When the 21st Amendment passed in 1933, it was a relief, as America could finally go back to drinking and repair the damages that were done during Prohibition. Ultimately, with all the crime, drinking, and economic downfalls from the early stages of Prohibition, it was never meant to last, though its impacts did.